philosophy of mathematics as one of the intellectual fathers of the practice turn in the philosophy of mathematics. Now, the practice turn has brought about many different ways of doing philosophy. What are the important questions? How do we go about asking them? What are the important methods to employ? Lakatos had a pretty clear idea, perhaps, in mind. A dialectical philosophy of mathematics. He wanted to found a school for dialectical philosophy of mathematics, but never got around to actually saying precisely what he means by this. So I'll be talking a little bit about Lakatos as the intellectual father of the practice turn, and then say a few words on the dialectical philosophy of mathematics. And Fenner will take over and tell you about the champion of today, which is Kneebone. I apologize for the poor quality of the picture. It's the best picture we found of this person who is not well known enough, I suppose. At least not well known enough to have a better picture on the internet. Okay, and then now, as you can see, those Lakatos and Kneebone were contemporaries, and in fact they were communicating. They organized a seminar together, they were talking philosophy of maths. And Brendan will tell us a little bit about this contact between Kneebone and Lakatos. Okay, but first Lakatos as the intellectual father of the practice turn. So here's Astrid Kitcher in '88, telling us that the mainstream of the philosophy of mathematics, which for them is mostly concerned with ontological questions, began with Vrije, and then the origin of the Maverick tradition is a series of 4 papers by Lakatos published then, and then later collected in his well-known Proofs and Refutations. So Lakatos is the one, the founding father. Now, 20 years later, Mancosu tells a very similar story when he says, well, it cannot be disputed that already in the 1960s, first with Lakatos and later with others, the strong reaction set in against philosophy of mathematics conceived as foundation of mathematics. Right, so here again, Lakatos is the first to bring about this change in the philosophy of maths and to bring about the practice. Of course, Mancosu will then, I should have put in that he's actually an editor of this graduate book. Okay. So this is from the introduction. Mancosu will then say, well, that's too radical, and we should have what he calls the philosophy of mathematical practice, which is then something else again. So here again, the philosophy of mathematical practice already starts to split into a bit. Van Bendighem is pretty explicit about this. This is 6 years later, in 2014, in his contribution to the volume Science After the Practice Turn, where he as well tells us that Lakatos has a starting point, but he already makes some noises about how difficult it is to pinpoint who is the first in history. And then he gives us all these different approaches of what is now collected under this header of the philosophy of mathematical practice. What does it all come to? And the very first one he calls the Lakatosian approach, which has to do with process rather than products. I'll say a little bit more about this in just a second. Here's a very recent paper by Hamami and Morris, who now broadened the scope a bit, right? Hamami being Van Bendighem's PhD student, so he knows about the difficulties of history writing, and then he says, well, perhaps the first steps towards the philosophy of mathematical practice were taken by Wilder, so a bit earlier in the 1950s, and Polya, and then he goes on to, of course, mention Lakatos once again, because Lakatos, after all, is this one shining figure, even in this account. Okay, so I told you that, or especially Van Bendighem told us that what the philosophy of mathematical practice is, it has splintered into all these various different approaches, but Lakatos actually had an idea in mind. Right? He mentioned that he wanted to found a school for dialectical philosophy of mathematics, but he never got around to actually explicating what that might mean. So here's us, and us is basically mostly Brendan, telling us about this, about what the dialectical philosophy of mathematics might be. Now, there's this focus on processes rather than products that already appeared in the Van Bendighem bit. Of course, we need to say a bit more what this might mean. And whilst Fenner will give us a clearer example, I'll just quickly run through these points. So the dialectical philosophy of mathematics seeks rationality and integrity in the development of mathematics. So think of proofs and refutations, right? There is this concept of the polyhedron that develops through the dialogue. And it doesn't develop just any which way, but there is some rationality behind this. Right? So what is developing here are the concepts, right? We are seeking the logic of this transformation of concepts rather than propositions, right? So this must be different than the ordinary logics that we usually look at, where when you want to deduce B from A and A for A implies B, then A better doesn't change its meaning, right? But change of meaning of the concept involved is precisely what Lakatos is after in his proofs and refutations. Right? It's precisely the change of the meaning of the term. What do we mean when we use the concept polyhedron? Now, the dialectic philosophy uses this inside phenomenological stance, which insists that the changes in the body of mathematical knowledge normally takes place for mathematical reasons. Right? So we're not particularly interested in power struggles and the rise and fall of empires, but right, we might agree that they can have an impact, right? And they probably will have, but usually the standard case is that these changes to the concepts, right, the dialectical movement of concepts, happens for mathematical reasons. Right? Okay, the very last bit is that dialectic philosophy has nothing to say about the ontology of mathematics, and so we will also not say a whole lot about the ontology of mathematics. And this is because no matter what ontological stance you adopt, whether you are a full-blown Platonist or fictionalist or whatever kind of other ism you pick, the dialectical story doesn't change. Whether you more and more approach the Platonic ideal, or you develop your concepts, the story of how this concept transformation goes and the rationality that drives this concept transformation, that doesn't change. Okay, so Lakatos was interested in developing this dialectical philosophy of mathematics beyond what he had already done in proofs and refutations, and well, he had this contemporary, Kneebone, who also did this. So this is a picture from a printout of the paper Mathematical Review by Kneebone, underlined by Lakatos. So this we got here in the archives at the LSE. So Lakatos read this and was happy with this formulation. So Kneebone writes, the philosophical theories of mathematics, whether logistic, formalist, or intuitionist, are perhaps concerned more with ideal conceptions of mathematics ought to be than with what it actually is. And we should therefore look at mathematics itself in order to see if it is wholly deductive or if any considerable dialectical element is to be found in it. And obviously, if we read something like this in the paper, we will find a dialectical element in this. And Fenner will tell you...
You've got a timeline first.
No. That's
What?
Yeah.
Okay. I did not know the order that was going. Okay, good. So I'm going to be a tour guide for this paper, the sort of two papers and a chapter that Kneebone was writing about the dialectical philosophy of mathematics. First of all, there's the question, well, was he talking about dialectical philosophy of mathematics? And very clearly he is. So he says mathematics on the face of it is completely undialectical, but this is only an appearance. It's my thesis in this paper that the basically dialectical character of mathematics is precisely the feature that has been neglected hitherto. So a large part of the paper is to set out this dialectical approach. Really, what I'm going to tell you is like an advert. If you like reading proofs and refutations, then you should go and read this paper. It's short, it's well phrased, it's very nicely put together. So the rest to come is just a sort of extended abstract for a paper from the 50s. Good. So Colin told us that dialectical philosophy of mathematics will look at products rather than processes. This is something you find there in Kneebone. So he says mathematics is properly a process of thought, an activity of thinking, and must not be confused with the results of the thinking. So that's an obvious part of the dialectical approach that we'll find in his papers. Furthermore, his main focus is very much on the change in development of concepts over time as mathematics as a field develops. And he links this very explicitly to mathematics being a dialectical process. So says, whereas deductive reasoning operates with fixed concepts, which might be represented by the symbols of logical calculus, dialectical reasoning always brings about development of concepts. Contrast these two kind of modes of development, and is more interested in the dialectical one. So when we carry out thinking that is dialectical, we fashion or refashion concepts in order to think more adequately about whatever it is that is interesting. He goes into quite a lot of detail about the way in which concepts develop, but it's really sort of first attempt. It doesn't go as far as proofs and refutations, I would say. More about how concepts are developing. It says, extension of concepts is invariably a feature of dialectical thinking in mathematics, as in every other part of rational activity. Concepts are never completely defined, but are determinate only in those respects that are connected with their actual use. So you see a practical turn is there as well. He's thinking about the actual usage. He spends a lot of time thinking about rational activity and what it means for people to be rational agents and approaching mathematics as humans who are engaged in activity. So these are things that are kind of central now to a lot of mathematical practice thinking, and you can see the sort of first blossomings in that paper. Another feature of dialectical philosophy of mathematics is that the development is rational. And so he says each concrete form of rational activity then holds its own criteria of validity. So even if it is this kind of active human practice, the criteria of validity are coming about, and in fact also changing over time and evolving. And essentially the same thing again. Concepts continue to change and develop, and reorientation of ideas occurs again and again, even in those theories which have already become classical. So he kind of rejects the idea that things sort of become fixed and stagnate. Even the sort of classical bits will be constantly challenged and new things will arise. Colin mentioned the sort of internal phenomenological stance that we're interested in the story of mathematics as mathematics rather than the kind of other external influences, and that's also there. So the rigor of demonstration and the rigor of dialectical development. These are by no means the same. And in cashing that out, he gives a whole lot of examples, quite small and brief examples of how mathematics changes over time. And really, if you read those, they're mostly a kind of a stable of standard examples now that people would be familiar with. So, but to illustrate that best, here's a sort of nice summary sentence. This is now from a chapter of his mathematical logic textbook, where he does a whole lot of mathematical logic and set theory and description and things, and then sneaks in right at the end a chapter on concrete and abstract thinking and the activity of mathematics. And this is these are some of the final lines of that chapter, so the sort of summary of this. He says, if we now think of mathematics as successfully understood by Euler, by Gauss and Cauchy, by Dedekind and Peano, by Russell, by Hilbert and Bourbaki, we shall certainly not look upon the history of mathematical philosophy as a melancholy succession of unsuccessful attempts to provide mathematics with an enduring foundation. On the contrary, we shall see it as a process of evolutionary advance, and we shall marvel that the progress made since this branch of philosophy reached maturity has been so rapid and unfaltering. So this book appeared a few years later, but presumably with the book it was written sort of around the same sort of time. So the last bits that Colin mentioned is that they're not really interested in ontology. Kneebone doesn't really explicitly say like, oh, we don't care about ontology, forget about traditional philosophy of maths. We're not interested in this. But a large chunk of the first half of the mathematical rigor paper is dedicated to sort of surveying the big three: logicism, formalism, and intuitionism. And he sees those as somewhat limited, and that the dialectical approach sort of moves away from the limitations of those things. And so reading it, you kind of get a general feeling that he's not as interested in the ontological questions, but there's no like nice quote to pick out and say, yeah, no, he doesn't care about ontology. So that is like a general picture of the sort of stuff you find in the Kneebone papers. One other point I wanted to make, is what you don't see there. So he talks quite elaborately about conceptual development and process of thought and rational activity and people as agents. So the question might be, well, what's different from what you find in proofs and refutations? The thing that's not there is the stuff about proofs and refutations. Right? So, like he's kind of setting out the idea that we need a dialectical philosophy of mathematics. but he doesn't really have much about how it would work or what are driving those things. He has quite small examples. He talks about analysis and concepts changing in analysis or things like that. And so what Lakatos does that you don't really find here is this very detailed process, the detailed case study, the look at how proofs and refutations or attempted proofs and refutations bring about some of the actual dialectics of these things. So in the Kneebone paper, it's more of an invitation to begin to analyze and elucidate these things, rather than actually doing the work of carrying that out. Yeah, you get occasional snippets where he's thinking about ways in which concepts might change, and he's starting to form a theory, but it's not elaborate in the same way that proof and refutations gives us. So that's my brief tour. Over to you.
Okay, so we should say, by the way, I mean, Kneebone was a mathematician, right? We should have mentioned that at the beginning. So Kneebone was a mathematician who was evidently seriously well-read in philosophy, and in particular in, I think, German idealism. So I want to sort of add a remark on this bit. I mean, what Fenner said is correct, but there's another aspect, which is in the book, Kneebone has quite a lot about rational activity generally and thinking and so on, and the debt to German idealism sort of flows off the page. He mentions kind of Kant and Hegel briefly, but I think that's because he's discovered that talking about them at length doesn't do you much good. It's pretty clear that's what he has in that kind of view, and so the thing in itself kind of disappears out of view, and what's interesting is the analysis of the a priori as we find it at any given moment. So things like the conceptual repertoire that any individual inherits is a priori for him. This is 1950s, so the thinking subject is always a him. So I think yeah, there's that in Kneebone. It's not just that he is interested. I think he's coming from a philosophical place where questions about the thing in itself have been superseded. It's a kind of I don't you remember Nick Jardine's work. You talk about Kant on wheels. That kind of idea that at any given moment you can't really. It may be that some of our concepts are just permanent features of human understanding the way Kant thought, or it may be that they're all ripe for revision. At any given moment, you're not going to know which of yours might be about to change. Okay, so here's the timeline of their interactions. Okay. So 1955, the top line here is Kneebone, the bottom line is Lakatos. So in 1955, Abstract Logic and Concrete Thought is one of those papers from the 50s. Shortly afterwards, Lakatos leaves Hungary. Later in the 50s, Kneebone writes The Philosophical Basis of Mathematical Rigor, which is kind of where he comes closest to Lakatos's concerns. 1961, you've got Lakatos's second PhD. My understanding is that the first PhD that he wrote in Hungary disappeared from the library where it was kept, and the prime suspect for the theft of it is Lakatos himself. 1962 is their first kind of encounter where Kneebone's giving a talk and Lakatos at the joint session, and Lakatos agrees to chair it, but also at the same time Lakatos sent Kneebone his one of his first papers, the infinite regress in the Foundations of Mathematics paper. 1963, Kneebone comes out with his book. Then get proofs and refutations. So they're working on this stuff at about the same time. In the Lakatos archive, we've got these two papers with some annotation, but no mention of the book. Where we got? Yeah. And then in the late 60s, they have a joint graduate seminar, which seems to have been a disaster. It seems to have been a disaster because I mean, you can kind of reconstruct this from the letters. If there's anybody who was there at the time can fill in the details, but it seems to have been a joint maths and philosophy seminar that had some of Kneebone's maths students and some of the philosophy students from the LSE, and they're trying to do well, the logic that Kneebone puts in is really sort of proper, graduate level logic for a maths student. And then they've got the philosophy is going on as well. So of course the philosophy students all did very badly at the logic because how could they possibly succeed? So most of the letters between them are actually concerned with them trying to run this disastrous logic and philosophy class, and they start off quite the kind of things you write to your. So Kneebone was the external examiner, I think, at least in 1 year. So they start off the kind of things you write to your external examiner. Yes, we agree your suggested marks changes, and thank you for your wise advice, and it's all. And then at some point, Kneebone describes some of the papers as waffle, and some of the students' papers as waffle, and there's a much snippier. You can imagine Lakatos, with his personality, needing to keep the external examiner on side, but not terribly happy about having his teaching practice shot at. So maybe you don't think philosophy is a suitable subject to be taught at university at all, right? So there's some of that. And then the correspondence kind of tails off. As Colin pointed out, they don't quote each other. So they're in contact. Lakatos certainly read Kneebone's papers two papers from the 50s. We know that they knew about each other's stuff in the early 60s, but they don't refer to each other. And once this thing collapses, the other kind of mildly amusing thing about the correspondence about the joint seminar is that as it becomes evident that it isn't working terribly well, Lakatos in the letters blames various other people and says, well, the teaching was all done by so-and-so, and the marking was all done by, I was far too busy putting down the student insurrection. Okay, so possibly our main contribution to Lakatos scholarship today is that we got, Fran is a former student at University of Hertfordshire who is a native speaker of Hungarian. So we got her to translate these few annotations in Lakatos's handwriting. And of course, with marginally, you don't know how serious to take them, right? I mean, it could have been sort of momentary reaction, or it could have been a considered point. But this is underlined twice. whatever that means. And he was sort of,
Brendan, and not only that, but very clearly underlined with a ruler.
Yes.
Which seemed to indicate that he did take that underlining seriously.
Yes, and this is in capitals. So anyway, here's Kneebone And it may be that one thing that may happen is on the previous page. So here's Kneebone talking about Marx and Freud. And so this is the abstract logic and concrete thought. So he's talking about the way concepts change and the way in which they become more definite. And on the previous page, he's talking about Marx and Freud as people who've contributed to our conceptual repertoire, and we're able to carve up our reality in ways that hitherto weren't possible because these thinkers have given us concepts to do it with that we might like to use. And one possibility is that this may have got Lakatos's dander up. But anyway, one of the distinctions that you find in Kneebone is between deductive rigor and validation. Right. So validation isn't getting your deduction right. Validation is the process of getting the right concepts. So that's the dialectical process. It has to be making progress. It has to be heading towards sort of the correct conceptual repertoire. And he says it must be altogether more complex for concrete than it is for abstract thinking. And Lakatos has left us this somewhat enigmatic remark: niche abstract thinking, which is kind of either there is no abstract thinking or abstract thinking doesn't exist. So I honestly don't know. I wouldn't like to say, perhaps others might like to speculate, about whether he has in mind there's no abstract thinking here in this kind of context, or whether he whether he was forming a view about the general topic of abstract and concrete thinking, and one line you might take and one line you might see Lakatos taking is that really there's no such thing as abstract thinking. That when we think, we're always doing it in some way concretely. That we're not syntactic engines. Where even when we're thinking in a pretty abstract way, there's always something a bit concrete about it. That's something that Lakatos might conceivably think. That might be one way of reading that. But in any case, that's what this bit of Anglo-Hungarian means. Here is a more more complex. There's two pens, so presumably two separate occasions. And this is in the mathematical rigor paper, right? So this is the one where he's moved on from, where Kneebone has moved on from giving his general epistemology and that Twitter meme, say so and so without saying so and so. It's like, tell me you're a Hegelian without telling me you're a Hegelian. It's like he's moved on from that. Now he's talking more specifically about maths. So here's Kneebone. Mathematicians know very well what they mean when they describe a theory as rigorous, and logicians give a theoretical account of demonstrative rigor, which is in very satisfactory agreement with this practical knowledge, right? So, and this has a bearing on kind of what's going on in philosophy of mathematical practice now, in some parts of it. Kneebone is quite happy to leave the account of demonstrative rigor to formal logic. And Lakatos writes here, not true. Right? Now, this you'll have noticed, the logicians amongst you will have noticed, this is a conjunction. So, which arm fails in Lakatos's view, again, is something we might wonder about. We kind of felt, actually quite possibly both, that it would be consistent with what we know about Lakatos if you thought that mathematicians don't entirely understand what they mean by rigorous, and that formal logic isn't the whole story about what. I mean, he has Lakatos at points in Proofs and Refutations talks about a rigorous informal proof, right? Now, still in the. I mean, obviously, I can't know which colour to take first. I don't know which order. But the red one is simpler. It just says excellent. So what's excellent? Well, Kneebone says the ultimate source of validity of mathematical knowledge must be looked for elsewhere in the nature of dialectical thinking. So this is this validity thing again. It's like, how do we know that we've got the right concepts? How do we know that we're building the right mathematical theories? Yeah, sure, having got theory, ordinary logic will confirm for us that it's consistent and that its proofs go through, but how do we know we're using the right concepts? This must be looked for elsewhere in the nature of dialectical thinking. So on some occasion, Lakatos reads this, just writes excellent.
Sorry,
Then,
time to wrap up.
really? Oh, right, okay. But then he thinks to himself and says, what is this? Forever dialectic? And think back to Fenner's stuff about everything is always revisable, everything is always up for revision, whereas Lakatos had this view that if your concept stretched for long enough, eventually you get a kind of terminal point where the content has been worked out. We noticed that the language of dynamical and statical terms, this distinction between proving stuff and dialectically developing concepts is articulated in Kneebone in this kind of dynamic static metaphor, which is there in Proofs and Refutations as well. I mean, we know he read Kneebone, and Kneebone's papers were written in the 50s, so it's conceivable that Lakatos may have read them at the time he was writing this stuff, but we don't know, and it doesn't really matter. This isn't a priority dispute thing, because we know they aren't very interesting anyway, and besides, there's no knowing. He might have got hold of these papers at some point in the early 60s. We don't know. Okay, and this is the letter. I just wanted to show you very quickly. This is, and all it tells you is that this is from Kneebone to Lakatos, where Kneebone describes his admiration for Lakatos's infinite regress paper, but also just to get a flavour of the man. In the infinite regress paper, Lakatos describes Frankel as a distinguished logician. Kneebone objects to this. He has done much work on set theory and perhaps even more on its history, and he is to be accorded much respect. Semicolon. But I do not think of him as a man with a sharp logical mind. How it would have hurt Frankel not to have had the respect of Kneebone. So yeah, that's possibly the clearest or perhaps most piquant indication of Kneebone's character. And now we will stop.
Okay, thanks very much.